Lon made a perfect segue to our next speaker, and I too appreciate the back and forth dialogue. And as I was watching the screen here from my perch on 475, I couldn't help but watching Anila's face, because I think she wanted in on that prior conversation about the implications for the ways in which climate change is affecting the poor around the globe. And so you've read her bio. Dr. Anila Cherian has just written a book pertinent to this topic. You see all the accolades and her terrific history as a climate change and clean energy expert, which she actually has on her Zoom call moniker. And in addition to just writing her second book, I think the affiliation and partnership with a bunch of the UN-based organizations is most prominent. But Anila, you're an expert, and before we figure out exactly what investments we're gonna make, we thought we'd take a tour around academia and your wisdom related to the topic of climate change and its implications as we connect to our to the UCC's mission. So without further ado, Anila, you're going to take us through a couple of slides and leave time for some conversation with our trustees. Over to you, Anila.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Lan. Thank you, everyone, for offering me this opportunity. And I am going to speak fast because I know you have a very important work to get to. So when I was asked to do this, I have to confess from the beginning that it is going to be provocative, and particularly in line of the previous discussion that we had, it is going to squarely look at the history that the United Church of Christ has had in leading us, the rest of the world, in advancing sort of our understanding of how important it is to confront environmental racism. So, my take on this is that, those of us who've been looking at climate change for the past, I would say, most of our adult life, we are despondent, but also excited, but we have to confront the truth that this is the largest intergenerational human rights violation of our time for those of us who are looking at it from an equity perspective. So Daisy, thank you so much for advancing this to the next slide. I'm just going to whip through some of this, and it's quite interesting that my slide presentation is rather, for lack of a better word, colorful compared to the previous ones, but that is probably because I am coming to you both as an academic and as an artist. So what I wanted to argue is that we have to be able to look at what we are faced with in terms of a generational and demographic loss, which is that we have known for a very early, from a very early start of climate change, that the poorest and most vulnerable will suffer. But the double burden is that per capita emissions from the poorest and most vulnerable, those that tend to be, women, particularly in developing countries, and the elderly and children faced with a dependence on solid fuels, are not the ones that are doing the massive amounts of, carbon emissions. So the least greenhouse gas emissions emitters are the ones who are suffering the most. So if you're going to do climate responsive investing from an equity perspective, you have to focus on fossil fuel related pollution. So I heard previous speakers talk about the divestment from South Africa, and that's the analog. How will fossil fuel free divestment work, but how will it generate investments towards disadvantaged communities, towards communities that are most marginalized? So from the get-go, we recognize that climate risks are not equitable, they're unjust. We understand that in the midst of this very technologically driven framework where climate risks are being calculated by financial institutions, where net zero strategies are being developed, where Rishi Sunak, as the former financial chancellor, stood at the COP and said, UK was going to be the first financial center that was going to be completely net zero. We understand that within that context, who is looking at and what's being done to address climate inequities and costs borne by marginalized and vulnerable communities that do not get their voices represented in the construction of what financial companies describe as, physical risks from climate change and transition risks. So those, when investment and portfolio managers are looking at the well-being of companies from an ESG perspective, you are going to ask those questions about transition risks and companies that have defined transition risks. But what happens with the nature of financial risks in terms of transition risks versus what happens in terms of the physical risks faced by millions across the world that are completely left out of that dynamic is something that, you know, socially responsible investing needs to think about, or else we're going to consign millions to sadly have their lives devastated. Now we knew this, we've known this for a very long time. In 2007, UNDP had a historic study, and though in that time they recognized that the failure to act conclusively on climate change will consign the poorest 40% of the world's population, 2.6 billion people, in two diminished opportunities. But it will also exacerbate deep inequalities, and that is what we're seeing in the current construct globally. More recently, the US Office of National Intelligence recognized that intensifying physical risks will exacerbate geopolitical flashpoints. And so climate change is one of those issues that multiple countries have to deal with in different ways. We've known that for a very long time. It's multi-sectoral, multi-dynamic, multi-dimensional, but in all of that, there is a clear equity piece that we've known all along. We know that the costs of the failure to act on climate change will be unjustly borne. And the flashpoints will be in places that we've not thought of. So you have a war in Ukraine, for example, which is not climate change related, but has energy implications. But then you see the quick debacle in countries like Sri Lanka with food security and globally, where when that is topped on top of heat waves and droughts and other factors, you know, the scale of the problem is just worsened. So we know that the IPCC has warned since 2018 that disadvantaged and vulnerable populations will suffer the most. So poverty and disadvantage are expected to increase. This is something that, you know, often tends to be glossed over in terms of looking for the profit motive. Next slide, please. Thanks, Daisy. So for my take, you know, the concept of the word climate apartheid is one that was first articulated by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Inequality. And essentially, we have a situation in the world where the rich can pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, while the rest of the world is left to suffer. And I would add that there is another piece to this where we are, you know, harangued by global climate change celebrities traveling around the world, you know, emitting tons of CO2, while massive, you know, swaths of human population are just left to articulate a vision for themselves, which is very hard to justify. So this concept of climate apartheid is something that, you know, I would like to put forward. It is challenging, but it's something that is worth thinking about given the history of divestment. So let's just ask the question about carbon inequality and climate being equal to climate injustice. Who's responsible for spewing greenhouse gas emissions? We know that the wealthy bear the greatest responsibility in this area. And, you know, in 2020, the combined UNEP, which is the United Nations Environment Program, every year they do a gap emissions report. And every year they tell us that the gap is expanding and that the likelihood, you know, of the window of opportunity seems to be narrowing, which coincides with what the IPCC is also saying. But the combined emissions of the richest 1% of the global population account for more than twice the combined emissions of the poorest 50%. Oxfam said the average footprint of the richest 1% globally could be 175 times that of the poorest 10%. So we are going to have to face a global scenario where which is going to be devastating, and we are going to have to layer multiple public health issues and multiple challenges at the same time. With climate change, you know, there is an exacerbation of disease burdens that previously were not foreseen. The deadliest animal on the planet right now is the mosquito. And you are seeing diseases that were endemic to certain areas of the world spread with temperatures warming, surface temperatures warming, and population suffering accordingly. So what I was, in my book, what I argued is that there has been an effective silo approach. You know, on one hand, you have people arguing in terms of aggregate greenhouse gas emissions reductions and countries pledging their nationally determined contributions within the Paris Agreement. But you have a separate track on access to clean energy for the poor. And that is, this dichotomy is illogical, because energy, we know, is the link for climate change. But segregating access to clean energy for vulnerable and developing countries and populations that are outside of the discussion on climate goals is not just illogical, it's actually unfair and unjust, because in plain sight, the World Health Organization has recognized that the largest environmental health risk, the single largest environmental health risk facing the world today is air pollution. And some simple measures in terms of reducing air pollution could save millions of lives, not just in countries where you are, you know, where you think poverty and air pollution coexist, but also predominantly in the US. In the US, for example, 68% of people that are communities of color live within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants. And I don't want to sort of just continuously repeat statistics that you know, may completely sort of numb our hearts and souls, because I'm very struck by the fact that this presentation is being done to a group of individuals that really is at the forefront of that investing of between faith and the future. But even this community needs to understand that, you know, in the 46 United States, in at least 46 of the United States boundaries, people of color live with more air pollution than non-white individuals. So fossil fuel air pollution contributed to nearly 1 in 5 premature deaths in 2018. What are we doing about air pollution in terms of short-term climate pollutants that can do that win-win for climate change and improve public health determinants for poorer populations? And I'm just going to have to whip through, because I'm aware that I have to be very quick about this. So the argument here is that climate change is an impediment to health improvements. If economic growth does not benefit the poor, the health effects of climate change will be exacerbated. We know that 7% of the global burden of disease was due to the inhalation of air pollution. So one of the things that's important to do is to firmly link climate change mitigation with public health tools, for lack of a better word, because air pollution is the largest risk factor globally. It's far higher than any other environmental risk and far exceeds all 5 other risk factors, including malnutrition, smoking, blood pressure, and alcohol use. I will go quickly through this slide, and I'm just going to focus on the middle bullet there, which is that the WHO's 2018 report included a critical finding as to why air pollution should be addressed and why it matters so much for the lives of so many across the globe, which is that the most direct link between climate change and ill health is air pollution. So the question is, why is the only successful UN pollution treaty, long-range convention to combat air pollution, only exist for European countries? One of the most successful conventions on air pollution is it's LRTRAP. It's the acronym for it. It's long-range transboundary air pollution, but it exists primarily for Western European countries and the US and Canada. And this is the question that I ask in my book, which is that we really need to expand it and confront and have an integrated approach to air pollution and climate and clean air justice. So one of the things that we haven't done is have a protocol on short-lived climate pollutants, which is things like black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, and hydrofluorocarbons. I am glad to see that the Biden administration in the Inflation Reduction Act has a specific focus on methane, and I will discuss it in one of the later slides. But there are some very, methane is more complicated, but in terms of black carbon, countries like India are especially devastated with black carbon emissions. And the problem with black carbon emissions is that it has national and regional implications. So food security, water security, all those things are going to be felt in South Asia, particularly with result of growing black carbon emissions. So one of there's been a lot of work done, and one of the people that I would recommend that you really focus on is the Drew Schindel, who's a professor at Duke. And he did an interesting testimony to the US committee where he basically argued that reducing air pollution actually is cost beneficial. So if you invest in air pollution reduction measures, the avoided deaths and the avoided healthcare spending due to reduced hospitalization, on average, it benefits the US and it's far more cost effective than, and will pay for the cost of the energy transition. Because we see public health neglect of poorer brown and black lives. We see that morbidity and ill health burdens of air pollution are inequitably borne by marginalized and historically disadvantaged communities consistently over time. Now, the United Church of Christ has a historic role in combating environmental racism. So the two questions that I wanted to ask is, have health and morbidity burdens that are impacting on millions who suffer from carbon pollution and climate injustice been factored into your climate risk financial calculations? And how exactly will the formulation of corporate net zero strategies translate into clean energy, climate justice for historically marginalized communities and Black and brown lives? Next slide, please. Again, one of the things, the reason I included this slide is because we are still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and there were several studies, including one that was done by Harvard that said, even a small increase in long-term exposure to particulate matter leads to a large increase in the COVID-19 death rates. And we have seen in the US the decimation that has happened in poorer communities as a result of respiratory-borne diseases like COVID. So it's a layering of public health neglect on top of existing inequities. So the question is, what are investors, including fossil-free investment funds, doing to respond to the devastating future faced by those who live under polluted hearts and skies, and who happen also to be the least resilient to climatic adversities? We know that poorer people are less likely to have access to insurance. We know that when a climatic event happens, they have less adaptive capacity, less coping mechanisms to cope, and fewer places to flee to. So the issue of household air pollution being a single most significant environmental health risk in the world, and the fact that it's disproportionately felt within poorer communities, should give pause, because it is something that is relatively solvable, but we have not seen that integrated agenda, both at a global level and at a national level. And this is just basically what I was arguing here. It was an integrated programmatic nexus that focuses on increasing access and really looks at communities, which I'm then gonna segue into the next slide. Thanks, Daisy. So here, I would like to just challenge all of us to understand something. Cities are the locus for climate justice, but they're also, as the UN Secretary General put, the forefront of the battle for climate change. That is where they're going to be done, because the world is moving to a more urbanized future. And cities account for 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and they consume 2/3 of the world's energy. In 2018, we had about 33 megacities. Megacities are those cities that constitute 10 million inhabitants. And I was surprised to find out that the 10th, by 2050, I would challenge anyone, if someone can answer that. I did not know this till I wrote this book. The 10th most populous megacity in the world is, I'll ask you that question later, but it happens to be Kinshasa in Africa. So we have grown from 33 in 2018 megacities to, we're going to have 43 megacities by 2030. So investing in cities and in infrastructure, because we also know that while cities are bastions of innovation and at the forefront of climate change, they're also hugely, there are big inequities within them. And some of the most exciting work on climate change is being done in the US, in individual states, California, Washington State, and New York. New York has one of the most ambitious climate goals, arguably in the world. So climate responsive investing must be integrated into increasing access to clean air and clean energy. And climate risk should be recognized as investment risk. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about, net zero strategies and or the fact that the US insurance industry is much less, has not sort of really, is not ready and poised in terms of explaining to the public just what a debacle awaits us, and just the fact that, the fact that insurance premiums are skyrocketing in hurricane vulnerable states like Florida and Louisiana, where we see businesses shift to, and where burdens are being transferred in the case of California to the state. So what happens to poorer people in those states when extreme climatic events hit them?